Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marcia Hashmi. Thanks so much for being with us. A year later and another Saturday, tear gas still fills some Parisian streets as police continue to try to control and combat yellow vest protesters. It was on November the 17th of last year that the protests in France came together via social media protesting rising fuel prices and other austerity measures. The first-year anniversary of these protests against President Emmanuel Macron and his administration continue despite a heavy crackdown by police. Will these protests last, and will protesters accomplish their goals? The couple of questions we'll be asking on this debate.
These men and women are French yellow vest demonstrators. They have been protesting every Saturday over the past year, demanding social and economic justice. These people want fundamental reforms and say they're absolutely unwilling to settle for anything less than that. So, wearing these yellow vests, they keep coming out. Gilets jaunes, or yellow vests, are actually neon vests that French drivers wear at the time of an emergency or a crisis. But these vests have now become a symbol of anti-government protests in France. For the past year, hundreds of thousands of demonstrators have mobilized against the government of French President Emmanuel Macron. Some of the protests have turned chaotic. French cities have suffered millions of dollars of damage and the most violent protests in a decade. French police have used heavy-handed tactics in dealing with the persistent demonstrations. Figures show that so far there have been 4,000 injuries among the yellow vests. The most serious injuries have been caused by police's weapon of choice in the battle against the yellow vests, the notorious flashball guns.
Parce que le CRS m'a tiré dessus volontairement. J'étais au téléphone et quand je me retourne, je me demande où qu'il était le signe de violence.
Despite the violent police repression, the resolute demonstrators have stood their ground against President Macron. They believe Macron is disconnected from their day-to-day struggles and therefore must resign.
Il n'en a apporté aucune, puisqu'il est méprisant, arrogant, égocentrique. Donc il ne nous écoute pas, il ne nous entend pas, il nie la vérité. Donc il ne peut apporter aucune réponse, parce que c'est lui le problème.
But how did the grassroots movement begin in the very first place? It all began in November 2018 when people rallied against Macron's deeply unpopular fuel tax hikes. The demonstrations soon turned into a nationwide anti-government movement. Macron backed down and abandoned his planned hikes. He promised economic reforms, but the rallies have not died down.
Tant qu'on n'aura pas ce qu'on veut, je reviendrai tous les samedis. Déjà, je viens depuis samedi dernier et je compte revenir tous les samedis tant que le gouvernement n'aura pas fait un effort.
An estimate from France's National Statistics Office shows inequality has seen its sharpest increase since 2010. So far, the Yellow Vest movement has forced the French president into a U-turn on fiscal policy. Macron's government has been forced into raising pensions and cutting taxes for low earners. But these steps have fallen short of meeting the demands of the grassroots movement. As the Yellow Vests mark the anniversary of their campaign, they hope their effort will somehow help reduce inequality and alleviate the economic problems of less privileged members of society.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program, author and journalist Gearóid Colmáin out of Paris, and investigative journalist Tony Gosling out of Bristol. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start this off in Paris. Gearóid, what is the key to the longevity of these protests in France, in your perspective?
Well, I think the problems are not going away. The problems haven't been resolved, and that's why people are taking to the streets every weekend now for over a year. The movement has decreased in numbers. I mean, there were a lot more at the start, but nonetheless, it's continuing to manifest itself right across France. The issues haven't gone away, and I don't think they will go away. You still have increasing poverty. You have people who are having trouble paying rent. You have a lot of buildings in Paris, for example, in the city centre that are owned by foreigners, by wealthy billionaires, and people can't get housing. You have lots of social issues that are basically not being dealt with by the Macron government, and that's the reason why people are continuing to demonstrate.
Tony, your perspective overall on how the Macron government has dealt with these demonstrations and their demands over the last year?
Well, obviously,
this is Tony. Going to Tony. Stay with me, Gearóid.
Yeah, I just think it's important to understand why this is happening in France, not somewhere else. I think that in France there's a tremendous sense, traditional sense, really since the Second World War and even beyond that, of social justice. So the people are determined that what they want when they vote is to have a representative in Paris who is going to deliver social justice across the country. There's an enormous impetus for that to happen, whereas it's maybe been worn away in other countries and people have kind of been ground down. The other thing is the French are very, very good organisers. They have lots and lots of political meetings and they do like getting organised, but social justice is the key to it. I mean, the other thing to understand is that the phenomenon of Macron has resulted in all of this. Macron came to power because of the infiltration by the far right of the National Front Party, Marine Le Pen's party. And of course, she deserved not to win in the presidential election because she allowed the party to be tainted by the far right. So that gave Macron the chance to come in. But of course, Macron came from virtually nowhere with a massive public relations campaign and heaps of money to get his party into a high profile so that he could take over as president literally from nowhere. And if you look at who he is and where he's come from, well, he's a former Rothschild banker, and they have all the money to come in a situation like that where they see an opening. The banksters will always take that opportunity to try and get their people into such a key position as French president. Back in the 1760s, Mayor Amschel Rothschild, he got his sons to start banks in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna and Naples. And those banks then went on to slowly but surely capture the governments of these various countries and large parts of Europe, because as we know, the borrower is servant to the lender, and the government was the borrower and the bankers were the lenders. And so as what we've seen over the centuries actually is slowly but surely democracy has been eroded in Europe, and the bankers have taken a bigger and more powerful role, such as now, I mean, they're appointing not just someone like Macron, funding him, but also in many parts of Europe, it's impossible for governments to choose their own economic policy. They're having them imposed on them now. So democracy's been eroded. That's why the French people are fighting back.
Well, Gearóid, your take on, you just heard what Tony was saying. I want to look at neoliberalism in general. I mean, not only are we seeing in France, but we're seeing in other parts of the world this type of blowback, it seems, as he's talking about, as the bankers have more and more taken over these societies. We're seeing regular people now take to the streets. Your take on this? Are we seeing the beginning of the end of neoliberalism?
No, I don't think we're seeing the beginning of the end of neoliberalism, or of liberalism in general. I mean, I think neoliberalism is a form of liberalism, and the left and the right internationally, as are the far right and the far left, pretty much all liberal. Even Marine Le Pen is a liberal to a certain extent. What we're seeing really, I think, what is emerging globally is conflict between globalism and populism. You have different versions of globalism and different versions of populism, but ultimately it is becoming more and more a conflict between banking elites and the people, and different attempts to sort of confront that banking elite. I think that one thing that hasn't been discussed here in the Yellow Vest movement is the reason for the tax in the first place, which was to do with global warming, climate change, the carbon issue. And that's one of the reasons for these hikes in fuel prices and extra taxes and so on. And that's going to get worse. Now, most of the people on the left who claim to be opposing neoliberalism are absolute believers and promoters of the anthropogenic theory of climate change, and don't want any debate on that. It's not even on the table. It should be on the table, because the theory of anthropogenic climate change, which has been very much discredited by various leaks over the years of scientists manipulating the data. Not only that, but many of the top scientists.
What are you saying, Gearóid? Why would tell me why would you? Why do you think that they want to do that?
The point I was just trying to make on this is that if we really want to get to the heart of the problem driving these unpopular policies, we need to look at things like climate change. That isn't in the. I mean, the protesters are not protesting against that. They should be. That issue is very, very important, because if you really believe in climate change, well, can't expect Macron to do otherwise. Whereas if you don't believe in it, then you could use that against the so-called neoliberal regime. And the neoliberal regime essentially wants centralized global control, and so if you buy into that, you can't oppose it. So that's why I'm saying that the question here is neoliberalism is a part of the problem, but it's not essentially it's not the essence of the problem.
Okay.
The essence of the problem here is an emerging global regime, which is based on taxing everybody on the planet.
Let me get Tony in on this. Stay with me, Gearóid. Tony, your take on that. Is what we're seeing indicative of that clash between globalism and populism, and this is what we're seeing not only in France, but taking off in more and more countries?
Look, I mean, I think what's happening is the French are just reacting to attempts to centralise power across Europe, and that the way that's played out in France. The other thing with the Yellow Jackets is that they actually have policies as part of their programme. In fact, they've got a very good, strong list of demands. See, any good movement has. The French know this. They've been doing it a long time. Things like, for example, leaving the European Union is one of the demands of the Yellow Jackets that's not talked about very much. And there's also this whole business of the tradition in France is really deep, and it's fascinating to look at, to study. If anyone wants to get on a search and have a look at some of the stuff to do with for example, the tradition of Guy Debord in France and the Society of the Spectacle, using art for political purposes, using humour to get your political ends. The Paris street protests of 1968. The Yellow Jackets very much draw on this, using humour, using political theatre to get media attention, to get change. And that's why I think that there's a genuine attempt to squash media coverage of what's been going over in Paris over the last year and other cities in France. We've now got, with the Western media, we've got this whole separation of the good protests and the bad protests. The good protests do get covered. Those are generally the governments that the West doesn't favour and that aren't slavishly following the diktats of the United States and generally the Western world and the bankers. So I'm talking about the good protests supposedly being Hong Kong, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, even today we've seen apparently, and the Extinction Rebellion protests. These are the ones that get the coverage, but the media coverage doesn't happen on the so-called bad protests. That is France, Palestine, Chile, Bolivia, and this is meaning that we're getting a growing, destabilised world with these protests going on, some of which are getting good critiques and we're allowed to know about, and others which are being totally ignored by the Western
interesting
media.
Point you've just brought up, Tony. What about that, Gearóid? Is all of this also part, he talked about the media, is that part of the globalist plan too? We see more and more what he says, the dividing into good and bad, and what is covered and what is not covered. And if we look over the last year, we will see that definitely the protests in France did not get the type of coverage. For example, if that was to have happened in Venezuela or Iran, we definitely would have seen a different type of coverage. Your take?
Yes, absolutely. I agree entirely. I mean, the thing is, if you take your guest mentioned Extinction Rebellion, for example. I mean, they coordinated their actions with the Conservative government in England, and it's very much being supported by the system, left and right. Okay, it's, again, Extinction Rebellion is based on this idea that the world is coming to an end, and we've seen, you know, these Greta Thunberg, you know, saga, this Greta Thunberg, I don't know what to call it, farce, really, being promoted by all the global media. They absolutely love this stuff, all this kind of, again, climate change propaganda essentially gets huge coverage, but people who are protesting against the consequences of belief in climate change, like the Yellow Vests, don't get any protests. And it shows the difference of class, because ultimately the climate change, global warming, energy transition agenda is ultimately about persecuting the middle class and working class internationally. They're the people who will pay for it. They're the people who will be controlled and will have no future. And you know, that is quite obvious. You mentioned other countries. There are demonstrations happening all over the world. And you know, in this case, it doesn't look like there's outside interference. It looks to me that there is in for example, Lebanon and in Iran. There has been protests in Iran in the past, and I think that also the Iraqi protests are being manipulated. But nonetheless, though, there are real issues there too. It's like, I mean, the way a lot of these geopolitical protests work is that outside forces get involved. Here, really, because the Yellow Vest movement is about real people with real issues, it's not getting any media support. In fact, the media here try to discredit it by associating it with the far right, by saying they're all far right and so on. They've even used anti-Semitism as one of the kind of tropes to discredit the movement. One of the intellectuals here, Etienne Chouard, was basically harassed by the media for being an anti-Semite. They basically started talking to him about the Holocaust, whether he believed in the Holocaust, in order to discredit him. It was absolutely ridiculous, but that just kind of goes to show the extent to which they'll go to discredit genuine popular movements.
Okay, well, Tony, when we look at the crackdown over the year, this last year, I mean, it has been an unbelievable, brutal at times crackdown. I mean, today we saw so much tear gas being used. I mean, we have seen, I think, at least 6 or 7 people, or 12, sorry, at least 12 deaths. We've seen the flashball guns that they've used, that people have lost parts of their body, thousands arrested. Why do you think that the police have come down so hard on these protesters in France?
Well, it should be obvious to most people that Macron and those supporting him, not just in France, but abroad, I'm talking about, again, the banks, the multinational corporations, the United States of America, the United States of Europe, the people that control the Western world pretty much, they are, of course, part of all of this, and they're seeing it as an opportunity to clamp down on civil liberties. I mean, we've seen an enormous, I mean, for example, the right of assembly in Paris is virtually over. There is no right of assembly. Now, this is guaranteed to the French people in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it's just been taken away. I mean, you know, there are various estimates, some as high as 25 people have died during the year in protest, because, yes, the police have seen it as virtually a kind of training ground to get ready for civil unrest. It's almost as if they're looking into the future, expecting this movement to grow and grow, because they know that the government is not going to listen to the people in the future, and that the government is only going to become more authoritarian. Now, you get this in many regimes where you get a criminal elite involved in running a country. They actually they are worried that if there is democracy actually starts to flower and flourish, and justice in the courts as well as social justice starts to renew itself, then those previous criminal elites will then have to go to jail. So they get a bit of a bunker mentality, and they start to think, well, we need to shore up our power. And that, of course, means taking away civil liberties in the rest of France. So this is, I think, going to simply mean that this movement is definitely not going away. The French are a dogged nation, and they are not simply going to bow down and accept things.
Okay, let me get Gearóid in here the last minute or so. Gearóid, your take. We've heard what our guest in Bristol said. Your take. Are these protests going to go away? And what do you think at the end of the day they will be able to accomplish, if anything?
Well, I think the main, no, they won't go away. They may, peter out eventually, but I don't think, I mean, that the growth now is about over 1% economic growth. So I don't see it getting any higher, and I don't see the economy picking up. France has been completely deindustrialized. The euro regime, the euro monetary regime, favors Germany over France. The French cannot get out of that unless they get control of their own money supply. And for that, they would have to basically leave the European Union or get out of the Eurozone. There's a mass immigration agenda is not going to stop. So you're going to have a manipulation of that by political parties pandering to either the socialists or the so-called left and the so-called right. That needs to also be dealt with. None of these issues are being dealt with. And of course, we're going to have a continuation of the climate change agenda, which is going to cost enormous amount to implement. And it's going to be extremely difficult for working class people to pay the bill.
All right. So you see the demonstrations continuing, and of course, we will be following them very closely. Thank you both for being with us. Author and journalist Gearóid Colmáin out of Paris, and investigative journalist Tony Gosling out of Bristol. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marzieh Hashemi saying goodbye for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Hope to see you next time.